Today, we're going back to the very end of the 19th century, so sit back as we travel to South Boston, Massachusetts. In the spring of 1895, a young girl named Alice Sterling vanished from the streets she knew, setting in motion a case that would grip the city and end at the gallows less than a year later. What began as an ordinary afternoon would become one of Boston's most unsettling records. Before we begin, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel as we follow this case from first disappearance to its final entry in history. In the spring of 1895, the Sterling family lived quietly on Savin Hill Avenue in South Boston, unknown beyond their immediate neighborhood. It was the closing decade of the 19th century, and Boston was a city in transition, balancing long-established routines with the early signs of modern change. Alice Sterling was born in Boston in 1887. She was one of 6 children born to George and Alice Sterling, who lived together as a family at 47 Savin Hill Avenue. The household was modest, typical of many working families in the area at the time. George Sterling supported his family through his trade, operating a barber shop on Dorchester Avenue, a short distance from their home. The neighborhood around Savin Hill Avenue was well established by the mid-1890s, connected to the rest of the city by electric streetcars that had come into use several years earlier. In 1895, construction was underway on the Tremont Street subway, reflecting the city's efforts to improve transportation and ease congestion in its growing downtown. For the Sterling family, however, these developments remained largely in the background. Their lives followed familiar patterns, centered on work, home, and the streets immediately around them, an ordinary existence that would soon be interrupted without warning. On Wednesday, April the 10th, 1895, Alice Sterling was seen outside her father's barber shop shortly before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Earlier that day, Mrs. Sterling had traveled to Everett, Massachusetts, to visit her sister, leaving Alice in the care of her father. Throughout the early afternoon, Alice remained near the barber shop on Dorchester Avenue, a familiar presence to those who passed by. She was known to people in the immediate neighborhood, and her movements drew little attention. From time to time, she was seen near the shop, while George Sterling attended to his customers inside. At approximately 3 o'clock, George Sterling noticed that Alice was no longer outside. At first, he assumed she had wandered only a short distance, as she often remained close to the shop and nearby streets. He continued his work, expecting her to return on her own. As the afternoon passed and Alice did not reappear, concern began to replace assumption. George Sterling checked the surrounding area and later returned to the family home on Savin Hill Avenue, believing she might have gone there. When she was not found, unease grew. It was not until Mrs. Sterling returned from Everett later that afternoon that the family understood Alice was truly missing, and that her absence could no longer be explained by routine movement or delay. By the time evening settled over South Boston, the search for Alice Sterling had moved beyond her family. After failing to locate her among nearby streets and familiar homes, the Sterlings began to seek assistance outside their immediate circle. A local police officer was notified, and Officer Perkins responded to the report. Upon learning the circumstances of Alice's disappearance, he joined the family in checking the surrounding neighborhood. Houses were visited, and residents were asked whether they had seen the child during the afternoon. No one was able to provide information that explained where she had gone. As the search produced no results, Officer Perkins reported the disappearance to his superiors. The matter was treated as a serious missing child case, and formal procedures were set in motion. Additional officers were informed, and a description of Alice Sterling was prepared and circulated. Police canvassed the area around Savin Hill Avenue and Dorchester Avenue, extending their search outward as the hours passed. Streets, yards, and common gathering places were examined, and inquiries continued into the evening. Despite these efforts, no confirmed trace of Alice was found that night. With no immediate explanation for her absence and no clear direction to follow, the case entered its next phase, shifting fully into the hands of the authorities. The first indication of where Alice might have gone came not from a search party, but from people who believed they had already seen her leave. As officers continued their inquiries, several witnesses came forward with accounts that placed Alice beyond the immediate area of Savin Avenue. One report stated that Alice had been seen walking along Savin Avenue in the company of an adult man. The direction of travel was described as southward, away from her home and her father's shop. The man was described as tall and stout, and those who observed them noted that Alice appeared calm and showed no visible sign of distress. Additional sightings followed. Mrs. Tupper reported seeing a man holding a child's hand later that afternoon. She stated that she observed them first on Savin Avenue and again on Oakland Street, before seeing them once more near Midland Street. Each time the pair appeared to be moving steadily in the same direction. Another account came from Mrs. Harding, who said she had seen a man and a small child near a railroad depot. The timing of her observation aligned closely with the earlier reports. As these statements were compared, police noted the consistency in location, direction, and timing, narrowing the focus of the search beyond the neighborhood where Alice had last been known to play. Among the witnesses was one man who recognized the stranger beside Alice and knew him by name. He was a railroad employee who reported seeing the child in the company of a man on a station platform later that afternoon. The man was identified as Angus Gilbert. According to the witness, Gilbert was seen with Alice near the railroad depot, though he did not acknowledge the employee despite the fact that the two worked together during evening hours. This detail stood out, as the witness considered the lack of recognition unusual. Angus Gilbert was 28 years old and originally from Nova Scotia, Canada. He had come to Boston some years earlier and was employed as a laborer on an estate near Dorchester. His duties consisted of general manual work, including tasks that required physical effort and routine maintenance around the property. As part of this employment, he was provided with lodging. In addition to his daytime labor, Gilbert worked evenings as an assistant station agent at a nearby railroad depot. His work placed him regularly in public spaces and along the same routes used by residents of South Boston. Nothing in Gilbert's background, employment, or daily routine initially distinguished him from other working men in the area, and his presence along these streets had not previously drawn attention. The place where Angus Gilbert lived stood apart from nearby houses and roads. His lodging was located within a barn on the estate where he worked, situated near Dorchester and removed from the surrounding residential streets. The barn had once been used for livestock, but by the time of Alice Sterling's disappearance, it was no longer actively serving that purpose. Much of the structure stood unused, and only a small portion had been adapted to provide living quarters. Gilbert occupied a single room within the building, furnished simply and consistent with the arrangements commonly provided to laborers at the time. The location of the barn offered a degree of privacy not found in nearby homes. It was set back from public view with limited foot traffic and little reason for passers-by to enter. Access to the structure was largely restricted to those who worked on the estate or had specific business there. As Officer Perkins reviewed the witness statements and considered Gilbert's routine movements, the barn drew his attention. Its isolation, combined with Gilbert's access to it throughout the day, made it relevant to the ongoing investigation. At this stage, no search was conducted, and no conclusions were announced. By the end of the day, however, Officer Perkins determined that further action was necessary. As Saturday, April the 13th, 1895 approached, arrangements were made to place Angus Gilbert under arrest. On Saturday afternoon, April the 13th, 1895, officers returned to the barn near Dorchester to conduct a search. Angus Gilbert was taken into custody earlier that day and escorted to the police station. When informed of his arrest, he stated that he had no knowledge of Alice Sterling's disappearance and denied any involvement. Following his removal, officers began a careful examination of the room Gilbert occupied within the barn. Several items were recovered, including bottles, cloths, and articles of clothing. Among these were trousers that corresponded with descriptions previously provided by witnesses who had reported seeing a man with Alice earlier in the week. Attention then shifted to the cellar beneath the barn. The area was examined methodically, beginning with sections closest to the partitioned walls. As officers moved across the ground, one area drew notice due to its softness compared to the surrounding earth. Digging commenced at that location. Within a short distance beneath the surface, a small piece of footwear was uncovered. Further examination revealed additional items, and the search continued until the outline of a child's body became visible. The clothing found at the site matched the description of what Alice Sterling had been wearing on the afternoon she disappeared. With this discovery, the uncertainty surrounding her fate came to an end, and the search that had begun 3 days earlier was formally concluded. With the discovery concluded, the case moved from the barn to a courtroom in Suffolk County. On Monday, June 24, 1895, the trial of Angus Gilbert opened in the Superior Court of Massachusetts, presided over by Judges Dunbar and Sheldon. From the first day, the courtroom was crowded. Spectators and journalists filled the benches, drawn by the gravity of the case and the events that had unfolded only weeks earlier. Angus Gilbert was brought before the court and entered a plea of not guilty. His appearance was noted by those present, as was the close attention paid to him throughout the proceedings. The prosecution began by calling witnesses connected to the investigation. Testimony outlined the sequence of events leading from Alice Sterling's disappearance to the discovery in the barn. The defense in turn indicated that it would pursue a claim centered on Gilbert's mental condition. A defining moment came when Mrs. Sterling, Alice's mother, was called to testify. As she addressed the court and faced the defendant, her composure gave way. She made a direct and emotional accusation, pointing toward Gilbert as she spoke. The outburst disrupted the proceedings and was quickly restrained by court officers. Following the incident, the defense moved for a mistrial, arguing that the jury had been prejudiced. After brief consideration, the judges denied the motion, and the trial continued. As testimony continued, attention shifted from the events of April to the condition of the man accused. With the factual record largely established, the defense turned its focus to Angus Gilbert's state of mind. Witnesses were called from Nova Scotia who were familiar with Gilbert's family history. Their testimony described a pattern of alcoholism and mental illness among several relatives. References were made to family members who had been confined to asylums and others who were said to have suffered from long-term mental impairment. These accounts were presented to suggest an inherited condition rather than a sudden departure from normal behavior. Medical experts for the defense followed. Each testified that they had examined Gilbert and concluded he was legally insane. They stated that, in their opinion, he lacked the ability to fully understand or control his actions at the time in question, and that his condition absolved him of responsibility under the law. The prosecution responded by calling its own medical witnesses. These doctors testified that they had interviewed Gilbert on multiple occasions since his arrest and found no evidence of insanity. In their assessments, he demonstrated awareness of his surroundings and comprehension of his situation. With the competing testimony complete, the judges instructed the jury. On June 28, 1895, the jurors withdrew from the courtroom to deliberate, leaving the question of guilt unresolved for the first time since the trial began. After just over an hour of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. They had been absent for approximately 1 hour and 25 minutes before delivering their decision. Angus Gilbert was found guilty of murder. Following the verdict, the court imposed the mandatory sentence. Gilbert was sentenced to death by hanging. He was removed from the courtroom as the proceedings concluded, and the case entered its final legal phase. An appeal was filed on Gilbert's behalf, prompting further review of his mental condition. At the direction of the governor, additional medical examinations were conducted in the months that followed. Each report reached the same conclusion, that Gilbert was not legally insane and was fit to face the sentence imposed by the court. The execution was scheduled for February 21, 1896. On the morning of that day, Gilbert attended a religious service at the prison, accompanied by his sister Jenny. Those present noted that he remained composed during the final hours. At 10:40 a.m., the sentence was carried out. Until the end, Gilbert maintained that he was innocent of the crime for which he had been convicted. Later that day, his body was released to his sister for burial. With that final administrative act, the official record of the case came to a close.